Okay, well, good evening. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to this part of our new series on the history of the University of Michigan. My name is Gary Krenz. I'm Director of Post-Bicentennial Planning at the Bentley Library, and I appreciate your joining us. These monthly talks are part of our effort to continue the exploration of the university's history that our 27 bicentennial helped accelerate. In November, we had a wonderful talk by Lisa Young from the anthropology department on food at the university back in the 19th century. Next month, we're going to hear from Terry McDonald, the director of the Bentley, on the history and future of the humanities, or the liberal arts, I should say. And in February, in recognition of the 150th anniversary of the admission of women to U of M, we will be joined by Andrea Turpin from Baylor University. She has recently published a really wonderful book on gender and the changing nature of universities in the 19th century, and U of M figures very prominently in her account. There are schedules on the table of the whole lecture series just outside, and also an email sign-up sheet, so please sign up if you're not already on our list. And anything you can do to help us spread the word about this lecture series, we'd greatly appreciate. You know, there's always a lot of activity in Ann Arbor and at U of M, and sort of raising visibility can be a challenge. So come to the lectures, bring some friends, and I hope we see you. In the future. One more thing before turning to tonight's talk. It's been on the scroll here. But I want to talk about another resource that we have just released, a new website, historyofum.umich.edu, which is devoted to history of the university and that collects work on the history from across campus, as well as from the Bentley Historical Library. So I hope you'll check it out and let us know what you think. Okay, so now for tonight's talk. We are fortunate to have with us two of the most knowledgeable people around when it comes to U of M history, Greg Kinney and Brian Williams. Greg has specialized in the archives of U of M athletics for over 25 years. As many of you know, the Bentley's athletics collections are really remarkable, and I think there's little doubt that no one surpasses Greg in breadth and depth of knowledge of UM's athletic history. In fact, in a publication that featured him not that long ago, they said he is, quote, the man in charge of Michigan's football history, unquote, which I hope that means you can retroactively change the outcome of the OSU game. But in any case, Greg joined the Bentley in 1989, so congratulations on 30 years. Brian Williams is assistant director of the Bentley and the archivist for university history. Like Greg with athletics, Brian has remarkably broad, deep, and specific knowledge of the history of U of M and also of the Bentley collections, including the items in what we call the vault, which holds some of the real treasures. Brian has done extensive work interpreting and explaining U of M history in addition to building the archival collections. He and his team are currently working on a major project documenting the history of African American students at U of M. Brian joined the Bentley in 1994, so is this right? You guys both have anniversaries this year, so that's great. Congratulations. And please join me in welcoming them in their anniversary year.
All right, well, thanks for coming out. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. That's great to see, and appreciate you coming out on a kind of cold December evening. This is a fun talk to give, and as Gary said, Greg's really the guy that does the athletics. It's really his talk, so I'm mostly here for the ride, but it's a fun ride, I assure you. We both work at the Bentley, which is we have the unique opportunity to work with the original letters, the contracts, the programs, the printed material that tell the history of the university and particularly athletics at Michigan. There's a lot of history in an institution that's been playing organized sports since the 1860s and football since the 1870s. And there's been a lot written about Michigan football. So at the Bentley, we have more than 3 shelves filled with books about Michigan football, coaches, rivalries, great championship teams, greatest moments. So we're not going to spend much time on football. We promised a little bit of football, though. But we're going to talk about an era that is going to make us wonder a little bit how did we get from this. This is a 1894 shot of a game on Regents Field to this sport, that used to draw just a few hundred people and now draws 100,000 people. We're not going to completely answer that, but we're going to leave you thinking about that question. We'll get you close to it, set it up to about 1900 as things really get moving. But we're really going to kind of focus on the foundations of intercollegiate athletics at Michigan by looking at the development and growth of athletic competition at Michigan in the 19th century. So it's an era that sets the stage, that puts us where we are by 1900, but it was a student-run enterprise, almost completely student-run in the 19th century. It was an era before the current rivalries even existed. Most of the rivalries were internal, freshmen versus sophomores, law students versus lit, and external opponents were actually hard to come by. We were in the West, and there weren't a lot of people playing football or some of these other sports, so we were kind of wanting for opponents. But we're going to start with a little bit of framing just to give some context. So the University of Michigan opens its doors in Ann Arbor in 1841. Fewer than 10 students are enrolled. The campus consists of 4 houses for professors, a 4-story academic building that contained everything: classrooms, library, museum, chapel, and living space for the students. The students carried up water from a pump for washing. They cut wood in a wood yard and brought it upstairs. In fact, a student from the 1840s, looking back almost 50 years from the time he was enrolled, said there were no athletics in my era. In fact, our exercise was chopping wood and carrying it upstairs, and that was it. So the students in that era kind of woke up at 5 o'clock. A bell was rung by the custodian, got them up, went to chapel at 5:30, had a recitation, and then were excused for breakfast, then came back for more recitation, classes, the rest of the afternoon. So there really wasn't a lot of structure built in that would allow for athletics. And they studied a pretty heavy classical curriculum of Latin, Greek, and a lot of recitation. Second academic buildings added in 1949. A medical school was established. It had its own building. So by 1850, it had grown to about 151 students. But these are all male students. Michigan doesn't go coeducational until 1870. So what do all these male students do to occupy their time? And that question of how do they burn off their surplus animal spirits, we'll get to the origins of that quote. I knew that was, we had to put that out there to attract an audience. And obviously it worked. But with these questions, how does athletics begin to take hold and what form? I'm going to turn to Greg in his part of the presentation now.
Well, I'm going to start with just this famous picture or painting by Jasper Cropsey of the campus in 1855. It's a very pastoral setting, almost bucolic the way it looks. But as Brian said, by 1860, there's almost 500 students, or a little over 500 students on campus. And what's missing from this is the string of boarding houses that had sprung up around the edge of the campus. In 1853, the new President Tappan basically kicked the students out of those dormitories on campus, and they had to live in boarding houses. And so if you can imagine, a string of boarding houses around there, and then plunk 500 young males down in the middle of Diag, and you can imagine what kind of havoc could arise. So what I'm going to do is kind of talk about some of the factors that gave rise to this culture of athletics on campus and the need for, or the students' perceived need for a gymnasium and more organized sporting activity. As Brian quoted that one student, the only athletics on campus before that, in that early period, was chopping wood. But then by 1850, there were 500 men on campus with energy to burn. The students brought with them their own traditions of popular athletics. and sport, foot races, wrestling. Everyone knows the story of Abraham Lincoln being a wrestler in his youth. And boxing and all kinds of feats of strength were the normal competitions. And in one of the early histories of the university, one of the comments that spontaneous wrestling matches used to break out in that dormitory on the campus. And then there were also specifically collegiate traditions of athletics. Some of these derived from sort of the English university model, but many of them came from the Eastern schools. And the Michigan students were well aware of what was going on at Harvard, Yale, and all the Eastern schools. The early student newspaper had exchanges with all of those student papers. So you see that, and the Chronicle, the newspaper, would regularly report, Harvard beat Yale, Penn's organizing a track team or something. So they had a very good sense of what was happening at other universities and colleges across the country. And then it was also beginning about this time, this notion of physical culture and the idea of a sound mind in a sound body. It was movement partly in reaction to what had become sort of a stereotype of kind of the enervated student who was stuck up in his garret studying and to such an extent that he started to ruin his own physical health. Part of this this popular culture was both kind of a popular upswell from below and also kind of an academic and later on a very commercial event project as well. But some of it came from the German gymnasium tradition where these German schools emphasized athletic participation, calisthenics, and physical activity. And Ann Arbor, of course, had a very strong German population at the time, and there was a local German Turner organization. And then finally, towards the end of the 19th century, we begin to have notions of what Frederick Jackson Turner they called the closing of the frontier, the sense that buoyant outward expansion of the country was closing, that the nature of urbanization, the changing role and style of work, and it raised questions of what the whole notion of masculinity was. And there's now a whole sort of subgenre of academic study devoted to masculinity and what it meant, what the idea of it was to be a man at that time. And you have other developments going on. The Boy Scouts developed in that time, which is kind of another reflection of that notion. Teddy Roosevelt, was this the idea of the vigorous life, and he played football and was a great defender of football. In fact, a couple of years ago, as part of the Ford's book session, they did a book by a guy. The title of the book was "How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football in 1905" when he was involved in the reform movement. But the other factors too, were very specific to campuses, and one of them was this notion of how closely people identified with the class that they belonged to. Much more so than today, where you come in with 4,000 students and you don't progress with them, later through your college career. And so the competition was often organized by classes. So it would be freshmen versus sophomores, or the class of 76 versus 77. And in the Palladium and the Oracle, which are two of the early yearbooks for the university put out by the students, they would always have the class publishing it would always have their own class history in it. There'd be both a narrative, and there would often be sort of these mock epic poems where they recount the battles they fought against the other classes and some of the great achievements of their class. And then finally, athletics was also viewed upon as a source of pride for the university, allowing Michigan to take its place among the great universities of the country. How it could see itself on a par with the Harvards, Yales, Penns, and Princetons. And there's one quote I like. It's from an article from the Oracle by the Boating Club, and I just read it briefly. It says, and this is again the idea that we need to have this a boat club so that we can compete with the teams in the East. Let us have a boat club whose first crew can represent us among our nation's colleges, and in whose hands our colors, the azure, blue, and maize, shall ne'er dip, even though the red and blue frown upon us. And red and blue, of course, refers to Harvard and Yale. And then finally, another factor in this was that there was a commercial interest in athletics right from the beginning. The very first intercollegiate athletic competition was a rowing regatta between Harvard and Yale, which was staged at Lake Winnipesaukee in Vermont. And it was sponsored by a guy who had built a railroad station a railroad line to his resort in Lake Winnipesaukee, and he wanted people to come up to his resorts. So he sponsored this big regatta. But this idea of class spirit, as I said, was really important at that time, much more so than today. There's one article from the Oracle in 1883 where this guy kind of waxed eloquent about the importance of class spirit. He described it as there's a force almost unknown to science, which he called, he said, its first true fruit is a class organization that unites the members into a single body. And from that, all kinds of rivalries ensue. There's football, baseball, tug of war. But it also reflects itself in competition in forms like publications, social events, and these were other ways of the class expressing itself. And one way that this interclass competition and the class spirit exhibited itself was what was called the rush. And the idea of the rush, it can really be traced back as far as to Harvard in the late 1700s. It was kind of an outgrowth of the hazing between classes. And eventually, by the mid-19th century, it became almost to a ritualized sort of a street brawl. The term rush, by some accounts, goes back to Harvard when there was mandatory chapel, and you would sit in rank order by class. So the freshmen would be in back, sophomores, juniors, seniors in front. And when chapel was over, there would be a rush to get out. They were supposed to file out by class, but there would just be this mad rush of pushing and shoving, and then oftentimes outside there would be just a general brawl. And so this is a cartoon from the Palladium, one of the yearbooks from 1875, and it's showing what they called a rushing row, and it depicts, I don't know if this is supposed to be chapel or not, but it depicts, the students trying to rushing out the door, and this guy, whoops. Here, you can see him, it's actually supposed to be President Angel. He had actually come recently on campus, and the story is that so it was mandatory chapel, he had attended some chapels but didn't say anything for the first few times. And then about the second weekend, there was this mad rush, and he is supposed to simply have said, "Desist, boys, desist." And that calmed them down for the time being, but then the rush is resumed again the next week. So again, the rush could take many forms. It was essentially just a large group of guys going en masse to do something. So there was, at some point, it was called the post office rush. The post office was down on Huron Street, kind of where the courthouse is now, and students had to go down there to get their mail. So occasionally there would be just a whole mob of students go down there, and they'd get down there and be elbowing everyone out of the way. And there would, at times, the post office would close down when they saw the students coming. The other famous one was when the Four-Paw Circus came to Ann Arbor. The students decided they wanted to get in for free, so they just went down and just barged their way in. It turned into a mild riot, and the tent burned down. A bunch of students got expelled. It was one of the first great student protests on campus about those students being expelled. But the really uniquely Ann Arbor, Michigan form of the rush was called over the fence. At that time, there was a picket fence around basically the campus, the Diag, and the sort of the ultimate way to humiliate one of your enemies, your class enemies, was to pick them up and throw them over the fence. And so this could happen sort of individually. A sophomore could see a freshman and just decide, over the fence you go. You'd insulted me or hadn't paid proper obeisance to me. So here's a class of someone from 85 giving the boot to a soft freshman from 84. But then what the rush actually would really be just this mass of two groups trying to push each other across campus until one of them got the others to the fence and could throw them over. This is another illustration from 1872, which is one of the most famous rushes, and people were talking about it for years afterwards. And it was basically the medics against the Lits. So the medics were on the east side of campus where the medical school was, the building. Lits were on the west side, and they literally had just, back and forth, pushing and shoving contests until finally, this went on for about 4 or 5 hours, and some people even took a break to go to dinner, and then came back and resumed the rush. It says here how the medics rushed the Lits off campus, but in fact that's a satire. It was really the Lits it was really the Lits who threw the medics off campus. It's in the sort of the box, or you can see it reads "Go West," the one guy's vocal box there. That was the chant. The Lits we'd yell "Go West" to get the Lits over the west side of the fence. The Lits were trying to push the medics off the east side, over the east side of the fence. And then, again, so this is part one of the sort of class poems. I just took a little bit. And so this is illustrating a sophomore who the author has called Jumbo, and he's throwing a freshman called Hank over the fence. And the poem goes on for several pages, but he likens the freshman to a bandy rooster he flaps his wings, crows, and then runs. And as the poem goes on, so the sophomore Hank has finally just had enough, and he just picks him up and throws him over the fence. But then sort of a general rush ensued. But then after that, they settled down and played a football game, or it was then called a football game. And then finally, in the end of the poem, he recites how that after 3 state scores in quick succession, won the day for 85. In vain did Hank, the freshman, wait all that evening for the juniors to arrive. So it's usually between the sophomores and freshmen, but sometimes the juniors would come in on one side or the other as well. So that what was termed football at that time was nothing like what we would think of football today. This, another illustration from the Palladium, it doesn't do it just because there would be, anywhere from 40 to 100 people on each side, kicking a ball that was probably a little bit bigger than a modern basketball. And the idea was simply to kick that ball over to the other side, there wasn't a goal per se, but just to kick it to the other side of the campus. And so it was very much a kicking game. It was more like association football, or more like soccer than like the rugby game as we would come to know it. And it really was strictly a kicking game, and the ball wasn't the only thing being kicked. Students in these epic poems and other places would, proudly wear their battle scars and talk for years about, the injuries they suffered, and the glories, it was a glorious thing to be injured for your class. And then there's one passage here there from the Chronicle, the student newspaper. They talk about there was a battle between the sophomores and the freshmen, and the score ended up being 5-0. It's unclear exactly what constituted a score, but the number of sophomores engaged was 42, and the number of freshmen was 82. So there was no sense of even teams or anything. It was like whoever was on the campus on the Diag at the time just joined in the fray. So that form of football eventually morphed into what came to be known as pushball. And this, again, was played just with this giant balloon-like ball. And the idea was, again, usually be, again, one class against another. And the object was just to push it past a certain goal line. So here you can see, again, this is all down on Ferry Field. Again, there'd be any number of people playing. And this tradition went on into the 1920s. They would still have this as sort of part of a class day where there'd be all kinds of interclass competition. And there's just another later photo. Remember, other athletes would often serve as judges and officials for these pushball competitions, but there'll all be other contests too, like tug of war and wrestling and other events as part of these class days. But if you go back now to when really organized sports got started on campus, the first club was known as the Pioneer Cricket Club, which was organized in 1861. We don't know why cricket at this time, or who, or if there was some particular individual or group of individuals who were cricket players, but that was the first sport organized. And the club went on for about 10 years. It varied year to year, but sometimes they would have as many as 54 members that actually belonged to the club, paid dues, and were members of the club. But there would be impromptu matches, initially just played on State Street. And so when a carriage came along, the game would just have to move aside to make way for the carriages coming through. Then 1865, what was described as a large group of students petitioned the regents asking that a designated playing field be established. And the regents appropriated $50 to have a field marked out, and we think it was kind of over in the northeast corner of campus, roughly where the chemistry building is now. And so that was the first organization, but then there were other student athletic associations were organized for other sports as well. Again, these were all student initiatives. The administration had no role in organizing or funding any of these at this time. So various times there was a boating association, there was a university athletic club, which was, at that time, the term athletics often referred to sort of what we would call gymnastics or calisthenic type exercise today. Various times there was a boxing club and a fencing club and a number of others. And the boating association was initially probably the most popular and the most active. At times it would have up to 80 or 100 members, and these again are all kind of cartoonish reports from the yearbooks. But the boating association, their goal was to be able to go to the great regatta at Saratoga. That was the big event in the Eastern rowing clubs. And so they raised several $1,000s over the years, able to purchase 2 boats, were not inexpensive, and they acquired a building that served as the boathouse. And this is somewhere down on the Huron. You can see the train in the background, so it's probably down past Casey's down there somewhere now, so we don't know exactly where it was. So they were very active. They were never able to get it together enough to actually send a boat or a crew out to, because it was very expensive to get your boat and a whole group of people out there. But that was the great hope that they were going to go and face off against the big schools from the east. So these athletic associations, they were organized to support either an individual support or later, at various times there was attempts to have just a single athletic association that covered all sports, but it went up and down depending on who the students were at the time. They elected members, or they had members, they elected officers, and they elected the team managers and captains for the various sports. And they arranged all the competitions, supplied equipment and facilities. They sometimes would select for football or baseball, was they called often referred to as the University Nine. So from there, again, there were interclass teams organized at the same time. There's some interclass competitions. And then the association would pick what was called the University Nine for baseball, and later on the University 11, what we would think of as the varsity football team or baseball team. And these associations also sponsored what were called field days and other events as fundraisers to support their athletic endeavors. As there was no ticket revenue for most of these sports at all. And so it was all based on the membership fees that the association members paid, and then any money they could get through fundraising. And then the field days, one of their major goals was also to raise money for what was called the Gymnasium Fund. We'll talk about this in a minute, but there's been a long campaign to get a gymnasium facility on campus. These associations, sometimes they fell victim to campus politics. There was a distinction between what were called the secret societies, the fraternities, and the independents. And so sometimes there would be rival candidates, a whole slate of candidates representing one faction or the other. I was just reading about the 1880, I think it was, or 1883 elections for the Football Association. It was like this campus-wide campaign with sort of under slush funds, and one group was actually paying people's memberships so that they could come and vote for their candidate. And then so both sides did it and said, well, in the end it was okay because we raised more money for the gym that way. And then in 1890 was when finally there was a single long-standing University Athletic Association that covered all sports. That was organized by Ralph Stone, who was, and this University Association would be the sole manager of campus athletics until 1894, when the Board and Control of Intercollegiate Athletics was established, which provided some faculty oversight for athletics. But the associations were still managing the day-to-day operations of the various teams up until past 1900. So I mentioned the quest for a gymnasium, and this has been going on since the 1850s, when students first began to appeal for or describe the need to have a gymnasium and athletic facilities on campus. This illustration was printed in a 1937 athletic department publication on the 100th anniversary of the university, and it's described as simply copied from a sketch by a campus visitor. We have no idea what the actual source of this was or how accurate it is, but there are references throughout in some of the newspapers and other things to various attempts to set up sort of a gymnastics type equipment. You can see there are still rings and some bars. And students were constantly appealing for the space to do for exercise rooms. Occasionally, the administration would say, well, there's an unused basement in this building, you can have that for a while or something. But it was, again, always very piecemeal. So this question, as early as the 1850s, there had been sort of formal attempts to get a gym organized or get some kind of facilities for recreation. Moses Coit Tyler, who was a professor of English in the late 1860s and 70s, was very active on behalf of the students trying to get some facilities. He issued wrote a report about the need for this and talked about the need to create actually a department of physical culture, what we would now think of as a physical education department. And with the students, he actually worked up a proposal, and they went directly to the state legislature to try to get them to provide funding. It didn't succeed there. And even President Angel, as late as 1879, was still in his annual report talking about the need for a well-equipped gymnasium. And he says, that the health and consequently the intellectual and moral vigor of not a few of our students suffer from the lack of sufficient and attractive exercise. The students, again, this Chronicle and the other newspapers at the time, I have a constant refrain about the need for a gymnasium. And this is the article where we get the title of our presentation about this need where we must work off our surplus animal spirits. And the illustration at left, right there is what was most of the yearbooks. It's right at the very end, they would always have a section devoted to what they called the grinds. Those students who were so dedicated to study that they actually physically harmed themselves. So that was the allegations. This is personally a grind. Someone spent all his time up in the garret of his boarding house studying, and his body would simply begin to waste away. And then finally, there's again, these repeated stories in the newspapers talking about the need for this. And this particular one goes on to say that we hope the next appropriation will be not for books. We are nearly booked to death now. But will be for a building and a set of apparatus, and if possible, a trainer, so that we can tone up our muscles and leave college with something besides a diploma and a broken constitution. So one of the things these athletic associations sponsor is what were called field days. And these were essentially just athletic competitions, on-campus intramural competitions that were intended basically as fundraisers to support the athletic association's particular sport, but also to raise money for the gymnasium fund. Sometimes they also featured a varsity football or baseball game, and there was usually a fall and a spring one, and sometimes the spring one was held in conjunction with commencement, when a lot of alumni would be back on campus, and so they could participate as well. So they were very formally organized, some with faculty support here on the bottom of you can see some of the judges were Professor Thomas, Professor Cooley, Charles Kendall Adams, and others. And so it was a real mix of events that they sponsored, everything from the 10-mile walk to different kinds of wrestling, baseball throw, Indian club swinging, clay pigeon shoot, so the whole range of activities. And they kept very meticulous records on who was the campus record holder in all these events. Another fundraising activity that they sponsored, particularly in the late '80s and early 1890s was minstrel shows. It's, something we would be somewhat appalled at now, but minstrel shows were the popular form of entertainment at the time. And in this article from the Chronicle, they make the note that this is by no means original with U of M for raising money by bringing out the talent of students in a minstrel way. We've heard that there are similar schemes at other colleges, and there's been a number of studies. Recently, there's a scholar who's actually looking at the way athletic associations across campus in the East relied on minstrel shows as fundraisers to support themselves. Well, after nearly 40 years of student fundraising, they'd amassed about $6,000. One of their hard and fast rules was once money was designated for the gymnasium fund, they couldn't pull it out for anything else. So this slowly accumulated over the years. But it took a $20,000 gift from Detroit businessman Joshua Waterman to actually get enough money to really get the project going. Then there was some additional state funding. And eventually, the gymnasium named for Waterman was built at a cost of $65,000. So this stood, again, right where the chemistry building is now. And it was a pretty state-of-the-art facility for its time. So now that we've got the gymnasium built, we're going to go back a little bit in time to when baseball came to campus. It was by far the most popular sport from the mid-1860s up through about the late 1870s, and both nationally and on campus. There was a great boom in baseball activity. So the first campus team was organized in 1863, and a diamond was set up. We think it was probably just the cricket field was expanded to accommodate baseball as well. A formal baseball association was organized in 1864 with a guy named John Hinchman from Detroit, as he was the president of the association, team captain, and the catcher. And he'd been playing baseball in Detroit for several years and was considered a well-regarded player at the time. The first recorded result we have from a game is from 1866 when U of M defeated an Ann Arbor community team by a score of 33-11. And again, another time 13-5, and then finally they beat the Jackson Club 61-41. Baseball was very different then. You're playing with very crude gloves. Catchers were playing barehanded for the most part, even, and they were playing usually against community teams. They played Dexter, Lodi. In other words, they did finally play a number of teams from Detroit. A team called the Cass Baseball Club in particular became kind of a big rival early on. And it wasn't until 1882 that they played their first real intercollegiate games. And at this, there was formed what was really one of the first athletic conferences in the West. It was known as the Intercollegiate Baseball League. That included Northwestern, Racine College, and Wisconsin. Michigan finished the league with a 6-0 record, and that was claimed its first conference title in any sport. But Michigan withdrew from the league the following season. And again, so there's, again, as Brian was saying, there's all these difficulties in scheduling teams because there just weren't many college teams around. But so they did play the normal school at Eastern, Western, and then occasionally they still kept playing all these local teams and even a few professional and semi-professional teams. And then in 1890, UM made its first trip to the East where it beat Cornell by a score of 2-1 and lost to Colgate. In 1891, they hired their first coach. Before this, it had always been a student coach team and Pete Conway was a former major leaguer, and he coached at Michigan for about 2 years. This is our picture of the 1869 team. It's the first photo we have of any Michigan team. You see a very formal portrait. The guy in the middle with the big whiskers is Albert Pattengill, who would later be a longtime classics professor at the university and longtime member of the board and control of athletics. Another guy who was on the team, this is not in this picture, was Edgar Cooley, who was the son of Judge Thomas Cooley, and he later settled in Flint and became one of the financiers behind the Oldsmobile Company. And this is the first photo we have of any team in uniform. We know a few of these people, but the only one I just mentioned here is the guy down in the lower corner here on the right, on our right, is Frederick Stearns from the Stearns Music Collection, later on the faculty for many years. So this is where the baseball diamond, we think probably the cricket field had been laid out here. This is kind of on the northeast corner of campus. And you would be looking, at this point they were probably playing, you can see the kind of diamond laid out here, sort of the post for a base. And there's all kinds of stories about some legendary home runs that were hit into the medical buildings. We're presuming they're hitting up over the roofs on there. And eventually, as the campus developed a bit, it just became too crowded for baseball, and always windows being broken and all that stuff. And so eventually they started playing games at the county fairgrounds, which at that time was over on Hill Street, just below where the Rock is now. And then in 1893, when Ferry Field, or Regents Field, was constructed, it was both for football and baseball. And so this is a nice shot of the baseball diamond with the grandstand there. That's the new grandstand. So this picture is probably from about 1895 or so. And they would,
that's on the site of Ferry Field, yeah.
yeah, this is approximately where Schembeckler Hall is now. This was known as South Ferry Field. So the university literally bought the south half of that 40 acres first, because the north half was basically swamp. And so we're going to talk now again into the football beginnings. Brian, as you said, is going to handle the varsity football. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened before 1879. So the first official actual football association was organized in 1872, and there was an attempt to organize a game with Cornell. We'll get to in a second, but again, they didn't know the Eastern schools had been playing what we call a sort of modern football since, I think, 1869 was Harvard or Rutgers and Princeton. Yep. So they had had about 10 years of experience on there, but the rules still had not been codified to any extent. And before every teams played, they would have to agree on whose rules they were going to play by, how long the game was going to be, how long the quarters were going to be. And so there was a very still inchoate notion of what football was. So Michigan organized this club, and there were, again, class teams playing at the time. And then they selected what they called the chosen 30. These were the guys that were, in effect, going to be the varsity team. So in October of 1873, the association made a proposal to their counterparts at Cornell, and after some negotiation, it was agreed that they would play a game November 1st in Cleveland. Again, Cornell agreed to this, but insisted that the game be played under their rules. Michigan thought that was very unsporting of them and put Michigan at a real disadvantage because they weren't aware or weren't used to playing under the whatever set of rules Cornell used. But Cornell president Andrew Dixon White, who had been a professor at Michigan before he went to Cornell, wouldn't allow them to leave campus and is supposed to have said, "I will not permit 30 men to travel 400 miles to agitate a bag of wind." Now this phrase is one of the more famous quotes about early football, but we haven't been able to figure out exactly where it came from. Sagendorf, in his history of the University of Michigan, uses it, and he implies that it was a letter from White to President Angel, but we haven't found it anywhere in the Angel papers. The archivists of Cornell haven't been able to turn it up. The first place I found it was in 1937 in a New York Times article about, this was I think the 75th anniversary of college football. And it's quoted there, and then it gets repeated often after that. But I can't say that it's not a fact, but I haven't been able to find the actual source of the quote. But even so, the Michigan Athletic Department, their official records include at least 3 letter winners before 1879. So these guys were either presidents of the association or captains of one of the teams. So even though they never played a varsity game, for whatever reason, over the years they have become to be accepted as letter winners. But the other really crucial sort of turning point for Michigan football came in 1877, when student Charles Gailey introduced the formal set of rules for rugby. Gailey was Irish-American born, but his parents, his father at least was from Ireland, but they were missionaries in China, and so he actually grew up in China. His father died at a very young age, and Gailey went back to Northern Ireland and went to schools there and learned the rugby game there. And so when he got to Michigan and he saw what they called football, these sort of just mass games of pushing and shoving, he said he tried to introduce the rules. And there was an article then in the Chronicle in 1877 where it's not an author, there's no signature on the article, but we presume it was probably Gailey who wrote it. He listed the 52 crucial rules for rugby and had a diagram of the field and some of how the plays worked. But my favorite part of it is, in one quote there, he talks about, by a careful study of a few hours, even the dullest aspirant to football honors can easily master them. But I actually did it. It's not as easy as he thinks. So by then we've got the setting for when what we think more of as modern football begins to emerge. And Brian is going to take over now and talk about how football, as we know it, started at Michigan.
So yeah, we promised a little more football, and so I just love this quote that's at the top of this. The Football Association erected on the football campus 4 bare posts whose mysterious usefulness aroused a vague feeling of awe. So these goalposts went up on campus, and nobody really knows what's going to happen, but it was awe-inspiring. Michigan's casting about for an opponent. They've got goalposts. Football fever's caught on. 150 years ago, the first game was played, as Greg mentioned, Rutgers-Princeton in New Jersey. That football fever spread west, and Michigan just had a team, had goalposts, they're ready, but they can't find a team. And all these rumors keep coming up that there's going to be a game against somebody. It's getting organized. Keep talking about this possible game with Racine. And finally, it turns from mere possibility to a real game. It's going to happen. It's going to play in Chicago. University of Racine is in Wisconsin. They're going to meet at the Chicago White Stockings grounds in Chicago, May 30th, and it's going to be a game. The Chronicle gives us a really good rundown of the game, and it's a pretty primitive game. It's got a few hundred people witnessing it there. But at 4:15 p.m. on May 30, 1879, in front of 500 witnesses, Michigan football history begins. Toe met leather. Racine kicked off, and Michigan halfback Charles Campbell officially fielded the ball, and Michigan football begins. Team number 1, 1879. It's a back-and-forth struggle, a lot of defensive work, but the one outstanding runner is Irving K. Pond. He's particularly famous as the architect who built the Michigan Union and the Michigan League, but a lot of people think he's most famous for scoring Michigan's first touchdown. And I love his account. Pond wrote his autobiography, and he says that just by a twist of fate, he ended up going on this trip to Chicago. He said, "I was rather forced against my wish to join the team on that memorable trip." But of his touchdown, it sounds a little bit funky. He says, "My touchdown was made towards the end of the first half and involved a long distance to run to where the ball must be grounded directly behind the goalpost, which were near the north bleachers of the old White Stocking Park. To avoid being tackled, I was forced to mount the bleachers and run eastward along them until I was opposite the goal. I stopped suddenly, and fearing that a touchdown in the bleachers would not count, jumped over the heads of my pursuers to the ground." And so that's Michigan's first touchdown. I don't know, but it counts. So one game in the books, and we have an account, kind of a picture of David Dutar, the captain, his kick for goal, and so Michigan wins 1-0 in their inaugural game in the spring of 1879. And so this was kind of Pond's account that I read. He's also climbed on the tower of the dome that was being built in 1872 on the top of University Hall and did a handstand. And he said, "I placed my head in the center of the level place and raised my feet in the air and waved my legs about in salutation to anyone below who might be observing the act." So he did a lot of interesting things in Michigan history. But the problem was continued to be finding opponents. So 1879, we got a second game against Toronto in the fall, the more traditional football season. But there's some interesting back and forth about trying to set up where to play, how to play. And there's a letter that the Toronto Football Committee writes to Michigan. And that said, after considering Michigan's offer for them to play in Detroit, they think it's impossible for us to play you. The committee have, however, determined to challenge you in Toronto on the 8th of November, 11 men to a side. They've resolved to guarantee you $50 towards defraying your expenses and also a dinner on the day of the match. $50 and a dinner, that's sounding pretty good. But the letter went on to say they're not backed up by any association, so the money's all coming from them. They do secure the grounds and the advertising, that would all be at their own expense. If they got some gate revenue over 50, they'd share that with Michigan. But the key thing, they said, this is the first time any arrangement of such kind has been made, and we do not know how it will work. There was a lot of this kind of flying by the seat of the pants, trying to figure out how to make this work. Michigan really didn't know how to make it work either. They rejected that offer to play in Toronto, instead said, how about we'll give you $100 and you come here and we'll play in Detroit on November 1. So they do. Toronto agrees to that, and we end up playing them. There's an interesting account in the newspaper of a train from Ann Arbor going to Detroit on November 1. Said 200 fellows bent on witnessing the coming football contest between Michigan and Toronto had a lively ride with music, and when they got to Detroit, a column was formed and a line of march began. And they said that line of march went past the Detroit Free Press office, where 3 hearty cheers were given for Quimby and his paper. The first inning began at 3:15. Michigan captain David Dittar kicked off. It's described as a defensive affair. There's a short rest, kind of a halftime, and then what they called the second inning. But again, Michigan got within a few feet of the Toronto goal line, but never crossed it. The game ended in a scoreless tie. But we know these people were from Toronto, so they're very polite. Canadians are polite. And so they say, too much cannot be said in praise of the appearance and bearing of the Toronto team. They have all the qualities of perfect gentlemen, and it is a genuine pleasure to meet them in such a contest. So things went so well, we decided in 1880 to play Toronto again, and so that's the entire 1880 season. And then in 1881, we thought we've got this football thing down. It's time to see how we measure up against the teams in the East. And so it was time for a trial of strength. So 1881, they went 12 players, got on the train, went east. In a period of 5 days, they played 3 football games. Played Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. A member of that team, Richard Dott, wrote an account of that largely self-funded trip. And he said, we boarded the train, foregoing the luxury of sleeper cars. The man who possessed a whole seat was fortunate. During the 2 days and 1 night spent on the train, those who couldn't sleep saw no reason why the others should either. So they arrived without much rest, had a game to play, but they had also received a shock. They, instead of the round association ball Michigan had trained and played with, they were forced to use the smaller and livelier egg-shaped ball that had just been adopted by the Eastern schools. So Michigan protested and said, we're not used to that, but they were overruled, proceeded to play, lost all 3 games, but got a very sound football education on that. 1882, they couldn't find any games, no outside opponents at all, so no games were played intercollegiately. But still, this plucky team, 1883, decided we need to go west again. And they petitioned the faculty. There's a document that I just love. It's they ask a formal petition to the faculty, and they're taking 11 or 12 men. So 11 men for the team and one extra. And you think of today's travel squad, 72 players, and so we're taking 1 extra. And but they asked to be allowed to miss class, and they petitioned the faculty in writing, and it said, it's the universal sentiment among the students of the university that our football team visit the East for a trial of strength with the Eastern teams. Therefore, the students do urgently petition you, the faculty, to grant the team for this purpose leave of absence from work in the university, and they laid out several days. It was a pretty arduous trip, again, going by train. They're going to play Wesleyan, Yale, Harvard, and Stevens Institute. Another hitch in the plan. So they plan to arrive in Hartford, Connecticut on Sunday afternoon, but instead have an 8-hour delay in Niagara Falls due to the adoption of standard time on that day. And so the train schedule has changed. Standard time was adopted. So they decide to make the best of it. And so Michigan has the fastest man on their team, Fred Bonine, ends up staging races with the locals. And he's kind of a ringer. He is really fast, a track athlete. And so they help fund part of their trip, just him winning bets, beating the locals in foot races. So they reach their destination, have to get ready for an afternoon game. Two players, Horace Prettyman and Henry Kalea, were sent off to make arrangements while the rest of the team found food. They play. They ended up losing to Wesleyan, Yale, and Harvard. But they continued to learn more about this Eastern style of play and figured out how to do it. The rest of the 1880s, still, looking about for opponents. The schedule's really filled out with athletic clubs, small colleges. We play a lot of games with Albion, the Windsor Club, the Detroit Athletic Club, Chicago University Club. But there's one addition to the schedule in 1887. So Notre Dame gets wind that Michigan is going to play a Thanksgiving game in Chicago and asked, would Michigan be willing to stop by on their way to Chicago in South Bend and teach them the Eastern rules of football. So November 23, 1887, Michigan team stops got off the train at Niles, Michigan, met by a contingent from Notre Dame. They run them through the rules. They split the squads up and have a couple scrimmages, and then decide, why don't we play a game, see how it works. And nobody's sure if it's a game that counts or not, but played. Michigan wins 26-0. There's an account by a Notre Dame player years later. He said, we always thought it was a practice game, but then years later they decided it was Notre Dame's first intercollegiate football game, so I guess that made us historic. So the two teams played again in the spring of 1888 for 2 more games. And meanwhile, Michigan continued to try to find opponents, build a schedule a little bit. But they continue to try and beat these Eastern teams. That's the real mark of success. It's can you compete? Can you beat an SEC team? Can you beat Ohio State? We'll stop there on that. But they also in 1891, a thing that happens to start changing things is we can kind of see an interesting thing here is we have a coach. All these other years, coaches are none. 1891, we have our first professional coach, and that's a turning point in Michigan football history, too. They hired a string of these guys that had played for these Eastern teams, that either Princeton or Yale, that knew more about that game and could really formally coach and train. And so we continue to want to play Eastern teams and take on Cornell. And we play them 6 times between 1889 and 1892, and lose soundly every time, but keep trying. Got a little closer in 1891 with the coach, but 1894 is the year things turned. We played them twice. We played them in Ithaca, New York, lost 22-0, had a rematch in Detroit 3 weeks later, and we finally win 12-4. So Michigan's on the way. They finally beat an Ivy League Eastern power, and things are turning up. Another thing is Michigan starts to think of a home field. All the time we've been on the road playing in Toronto, Chicago, Detroit. But May 12, 1883, Michigan played its first home game in Ann Arbor, the Washtenaw County Fairgrounds that Greg had mentioned. They played the Detroit Independents as part of one of these field day exercises. Horace Prettyman scored the first home touchdown. Horace Prettyman is also famous for having played 8 years. Pre-eligibility rules, he has the longest tenure in Michigan football history, and that's probably going to stand. And there's some question that he even may have played a game or two later after that. But the big games for Michigan continue to be played in Detroit at Detroit Athletic Club, or Bennett Field, which was home of the Detroit Tigers. They finally, in 1890, the Regents approve land along South State Street for what would, as Greg mentioned, Regents Field. They got an additional $4,500 for fitting up the athletic field. A quarter-mile track was laid out, and they built a grandstand that could hold about 400 people. October 4, 1893, U of M defeats the Detroit Athletic Club 6-0 in the first game at Regents Field, our permanent home field. And thanks to an engineering student in the class of 1895, David LaFavor, we have the first known action shots of games in Regents Field. And we can kind of see that's the dome for University Tower and the smokestack for the power plant, so it's kind of looking north. But, you know, not an awful lot of spectators. And, you know, the grandstand holds about 400 people. This is kind of a view looking towards State Street, but we see these, the grandstand. It burned down in 1895, so a year after this photo was taken. They built a bigger one that showed up, but things are really starting to look up for Michigan now. We've got a permanent home field, we've got professional coaches, and finally beat an Eastern team. I'm going to turn it back over to Greg to talk about some of the other sports that came up after football. And I think we'll do some of these pretty quickly.
So track and field was the next major sport that started having intercollegiate competition. The first competition came in 1893, but individuals had competed earlier than that. You can see from the photo, bike racing was considered part of the regular track and field competition at the time. And this here is our friend Fred Bonine, who was the ringer on the 1883 trip east. He competed as an individual at what was called the Intercollegiate Championships held at the Manhattan Athletic Grounds, and he came in first place in a 100-yard dash. So he was probably considered Michigan's first national champion of any sort. And for years, he held basically all of the running records from those field day competitions. Tennis became a very popular sport both nationally and at Michigan. In the late 1880s and 1890s, there were regular tournaments on campus, both a big fall and a spring tournament. Both among students and faculty members also participated in some of them. And it was like a very fashionable sport, kind of in every sense. You can see on the top there, it was both men and women played it. And then our first intercollegiate competitors were in 1890 when George Codd and James Angel participated in what was called the Northwest Championship. George Codd went on to become a congressman and mayor of Detroit. He was also a pitcher on the baseball team. James Angel is the son of President Angel and later went on to become president of Yale University. They came in second place in that tournament when Angel broke his leg during the third match, or broke his ankle. And then in 1897, Michigan won its first conference championship. But it wasn't very popular just as a casual recreational sport on campus, so there are any number of lawn tennis courts that were laid out. This one here is the old museum building, approximately where the art museum is, the lawn of the art museum today. But there's other photos where you would just see a tennis net strung up between a couple trees for just casual play.
Greg, could you go back one? I just had a question. Codd and Angel, were those team jackets, and do you suppose that design is still available?
I would check it.
Pretty sharp.
It should be, yeah. And then there were some other new sports that began to emerge in the late 1890s. One was known as the hare and hound races. This was kind of a national craze. It was sort of a precursor of cross country. The idea was you would have a group of runners. There would be a hare who would go out in front, leaving a trail of paper, some kind of a clue. A few minutes later, the others would follow him, and he would go out to some usually predetermined spot. And then when the others got there, then there would be a race to get back, but they had to follow the same course coming back. And so they would run from campus out to Whitmore Lake or Ypsilanti and stuff. And this was for several years very popular. And it died out around the turn of the century, but this kind of distance running really laid the foundation for Michigan's track teams, which in the early 1900s just dominated in events like the 2 mile and 4 mile relay. They were national champions for 8 or 10 years in a row. There was also a hockey club organized. The students had been playing casual hockey down on the Huron River periodically for years. But in 1899, actual club is organized, and they are playing. There's just before that, a Weinberg's skating rink had opened up, which was down kind of where the armory, not the armory, where the Coliseum, yeah. That's where that was. So there was in the winter, it was an ice skating rink, and it was actually an enclosed rink, or at least partially an enclosed rink. And then in the summer, they also flooded the area. It was the community swimming pool as well. And then finally, there was a golf club organized. This is both, again, student and faculty. Professors Wenley and Trueblood were very important in organizing this. Neither hockey or golf became actual varsity sports until 1920s. But there was, again, a golf team was organized every year. Occasionally, individuals would compete in a meet in Chicago every year that was sort of for the Western Championship. And we want to talk just briefly, at least, about recreation and athletics for women on campus. As Brian said, women came to campus in 1870. We don't know a lot about what kind of resources were available for them in the early years. We just like this great photo of women rowing on the Huron. But shortly after the men began organizing, or after women came on campus, they began organizing themselves for a gymnasium through the Michigan League. Again, they did all kinds of fundraising activities on their own, and they finally raised close to $21,000. And then the Regents committed the remainder, and it got a large donation from Regent Levi Barber. And so the building was erected right adjacent to Waterman Gym, the men's gymnasium, and there was actually possibilities they were connected so they could open up the gym floor to both sides. So it became sort of the university's big banquet and reception room for many years. And it also housed the office of the Dean of Women and the Department of Physical Education for Women. One of the things we think about this, so the men's gymnasium was finished in 1892. James Naismith invented basketball, the gymnasium was under construction in 1892-93. James Naismith invented basketball in 1892. So when Waterman for men opened, as far as we can tell, there were no baskets in the gymnasium. We think Barber, the women's gymnasium, had baskets for years, and it's quite possible that women were playing at least organized basketball on campus before men were, because we have a reference in one of the newspapers, in the Daily, to a basketball game for women being played in 1899. We don't find any references to men's organized games until about 1906 or so. And says eventually the women would organize themselves as Women's Athletic Association, which is sponsored essentially intramural competitions. Occasionally there would be a competition with outside schools. And so this athletic association would manage women's athletics until the 1950s, really. And so kind of bringing the century to the close, sort of the climax for Michigan athletics was the 1900 Olympics in Paris. 4 Michigan men went to Paris to compete. They were accompanied by Charles Baird, the coach, and some local businessmen put up money to sponsor the trip for them. The 1900 Olympics was a horribly disorganized affair. It spread out over about 4 months. And Michigan came back with a couple medals, but the one that was in the pole vault competition, it was originally scheduled to take place on a Sunday, and many of the U.S. athletes said, no, we can't compete on a Sunday. So they agreed, okay, we'll hold the competition another day, but then they went ahead and held it on Sunday anyway, so the Americans couldn't compete. Then they had a special competition, and the Michigan guy won a silver medal in that special competition. But it was considered a great success. It was really the beginning of Michigan's long history in the Olympics. And so when we come to the close of the century, we really have 3 people in place, or soon to be in place, who really became the foundation for the modern Michigan athletic plant. And department. Keen Fitzpatrick was the track coach and football trainer. He came to Michigan in 1898. He was a well-known runner in his own right back in New England of what were called the hose and ladder teams. All the local fire departments would sponsor track teams. As fire departments were private events organizations, and they would raise money in whatever way they could. One of them was to sponsor track teams, and so he was sort of a semi-professional runner. Charles Baird had been a Michigan student, captain of the manager of the 1893 and 94 teams. He went to Chicago after graduation, then came back. His formal title was Graduate Director of Outdoor Athletics. There was another director for the gymnasium. But he was, in effect, considered the first athletic director. And then he's the one who, in 1901, who hired Fielding Yost to be the football coach. And that really set the stage for the modern Michigan athletic department and all that we have today. So we're going to wrap there. If there's any questions, we'd be happy.
Greg, in the late 1800s, you started seeing the black M.
Mhm.
And then then like you see the other kind of a mishmash, but in that latter photo you have again that they had black M's on.
Yeah.
Was there any official designation or recognition? Because it kind of seemed like, oh, there it is, and then it's gone, and then
Yeah,
it
there's
comes back.
very different formulations of what the Michigan logo was like. We're actually, someone's coming to the library next week from Michigan Creative, I think, to do a little video about the evolution of the block M. Early on, the team sort of designed their own. If you look at some of the early baseball, it's sort of an Old English style letter. Some of them very elaborate, sort of an intertwined U of M and a B for baseball, or a BT for baseball team. The earliest ones we have for football, it looks like they just drew an M on their sweater. Others, you can see that it's actually an M stitched on, but there's very different styles of M's. By 1897, you begin to see something that looks like the block M, but in the team photo, there may be 3 or 4 different versions of M's on different letters. And it's around 1904 when the athletic department starts to specify what at least the letter that's awarded to the players will look like. And that's really that's where the block M really begins to be formalized. And it's very specific that, the football team got one size, track and baseball got a different size and things like that. And so that's when it becomes formalized.
And Charles Baird donated the Caroline.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, he was
Director.
served as athletic director until 1908, and then I think his wife was from Kansas City, and he went down there and basically took over a banking business. Was very successful, but stayed very involved in Michigan athletics, and then donated, I think it was like $30,000 in the 1920s to fund the construction of the Carillon.
And that was after Stagg created a Carillon at University of
Chicago.
Chicago. And his thought was if we had the bells ringing at 10 o'clock, then that would be curfew for the football team. And so Baird, very soon after,
Yeah.
created the Carillon here.
Yeah. Chicago and Stagg was the great rival, so whatever Chicago had, Michigan had to have something better. Yeah. Tom?
Greg, I was a little confused as we went through looking at how classes of students identified themselves. I'll refer to my own high school years. I was the class of '69 because that's the year that I graduated. But I almost got the feeling that there were references to when classes arrived on campus.
No,
Is
it
that
was generally, it would be their graduation year.
their graduation year. Okay.
And probably the way students who tended to go up into probably the mid-1870s at least, when the elective system really became the way that students took classes. But people would go through classes pretty much in lockstep. All the freshmen took all the same classes, the sophomores took classes. So they had this real bond and identification with a particular group of students that they were with all the way through college. Yes?
When did the beige and blue colors come in? I mean, that was a university thing, not necessarily athletics, but.
Yeah, well, it was, was the class of, what year was it?
I'm not sure.
There was one, I forget the exact year now, but it was in the late 1860s or 70s. The classes would each pick their individual color. And one class picked azure blue and maize as their colors. And that came to be adapted. And no one knew exactly what those shades were. And that when you see the blue was a much lighter, almost a sky blue in those early years. The football team, almost from the beginning, had a darker shade of blue for their letters, but most of the other universities, like public letterheads and other things, had that much lighter shade of blue until 1912, I think it was, when the Regents decided to formally specify what the color was.
Are there teams that no longer exist that won trophies, flags, or honors of any kind that are now held by the Bentley? For instance, you know, if there were bicycle races, but they no longer take place as part of track and field, do you guys retain any of that?
We really don't have trophies.
Okay.
We've got a few odd medals and things, but we don't have the physical artifacts usually.
Okay.
But there are, a number of sports that, like, we had a fencing team for a few years. Gymnastics came and went away and came back again. Same with the cross country. Synchronized swimming, yeah. And
Fab Five don't really exist.
yes.
Flags folded.
They might be resurrecting, we don't know yet. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, you mentioned Ralph Stone. I know you mentioned like the baseball organization, but like the origins of the Big Ten and like some of the attempts at a conference beforehand. How did that start? And like, why was Michigan kind of like in and out of those early attempts?
There was in the, I'd say early 1890s, there was again another sort of a football conference that was organized again with Minnesota, I think Northwestern, Chicago.
Yeah.
And
was just starting.
yeah, and again, it was partly scheduling, and I don't know what to extent there was, faculty control was beginning to be an issue then. But again, these early conferences were very much, the student managers. That's the important thing to remember is all of these things, all the scheduling, everything is done by a student manager. So we've got, again, we have Charles Baird's papers from when he was a student manager. So he's writing off to all these schools, or they're writing to him, saying, I've got an open Saturday in October. Do you want to play? And so they're, arranging this, while they're students and stuff. But the real move for the Big Ten Conference is really generated from the presidents. Michigan didn't participate in the initial organizing meeting of the Big Ten. Probably for some reason Angel couldn't go, but he was very much in favor of that. It was, very much this kind of a reform. The administration and faculty were, football was becoming such a big deal at that time that they were thinking it was just taking over the campus, really. Many of them thought that this was, far too much emphasis on athletics. Michigan in particular, when the Student Athletic Association, had a substantial budget, they were raising, or by the late 1890s, I'm not sure exactly, but it was in the tens of thousands of dollars of income that they were generating from games and other things. So it became very much a management issue, and the universities were concerned that this, football was beginning to overwhelm the academic side of things.
And if I understand correctly, the games we played against Albion, there may be some sort of a link in the sense that an even earlier athletic conference was started among the smaller colleges in Michigan that still exists. And I think it predated the Western Conference.
Yeah, that's
by
considered the oldest conference in the
4 or 5
country.
years. Yeah, Albion, Adrian, schools like that.
But Michigan, they thought very much of those as practice games.
Yeah.
And like Horace Prettyman, when he was playing all those years, he would maybe show up and played only in the big game at the end of the season. And usually it was how you got a letter was determined, did you play in, the big game against Chicago or Cornell or someone. But in his defense, I will say, he was actually enrolled in school for most of those 8 years. So he was, took courses in the law school and then courses elsewhere and stuff.
Were they online courses?
Well, down south they do that, yeah. But and then he later ran what was known as Prettyman's House. It was a boarding house that became the training table for the football team. It was right where the dental school building is now. And it was kind of an institution on campus, and Fielding Yost lived there for a couple of years when he was coaching, or when we'd be on campus for 4 months while he was coaching. But Prettyman he ran the local newspaper for a while and other businesses. He's a very well-known guy around town.
So in 1905, the Carnegie Foundation, I guess, created a report reviewing college football and reduces the 8-year thing. So I think that also brought the faculty control and the voice of the presidents into overseeing football.
Yeah, and that was part of what I mentioned before, that guy who had written his book about how Teddy Roosevelt saved football. In 1905, I forget the exact, but it was like 17 people had been killed, kids had been killed playing football. And so it was becoming a national scandal. A number of places were going to abolish football. Harvard actually did abolish football for 1 year. And so Roosevelt, who was a great fan of football, called the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Penn, I think, together and said, okay, we got to do something. And so there were some rules revisions, and that's when what came to be known as the Angel Conference was actually called by President Angel of all the Western Conference, the Big Ten presidents, to think about how they can reform football in particular, and it involved things like limiting the schedule and doing other things. And this becomes very complicated because the reforms went through, but Michigan actually objected to them and ended up withdrawing from the conference for 10 years or so. There's a whole other story that you would have to go into to understand that. But again, it was this whole question of how big a part of campus should football and athletics be, and some of the administrators are thinking it's too overwhelming. There was Wisconsin. There was a movement there led by Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, to abolish football for a couple of years. Amos Lonzo Stagg at Chicago was able to. There was some sentiment for that, but he had close support from his university president, and so he, according to John Crick at least, he posed as a reformer and reformed the rules very much to Chicago's advantage. But there was this general movement and concern about football that was just too violent. Too many people were getting injured.
Will Michigan ever have a physical manifestation of a mascot? Or is that below our,
I will just quote Don Canham on that.
please?
There was a movement in the 70s, I guess, to adopt a mascot. And this is something to the effect is, we're not one of those cow colleges that needs to have a mascot. I don't know who he was referring to, but so I'd probably not, I would say. Yeah.
One more question? Okay, well, thank you so much.